Okay, good morning. Okay, we'll find out. Okay, thank you, Murray, again for sponsoring. We appreciate it. Okay, so we're getting there. So 102a, Kuf Beis Amud Aleph. So we're talking about door bolts. Remember, door bolts are basically these things which stick into a door to hold a door shut. And there is a concern of certain types of door bolts looking like you are building on Shabbos, and that is going to be the discussion of this next Mishnah. Neger hanigrar, a door bolt that drags on the ground. So again, it's tied to the door, but it's long enough that the bolt reaches the ground. So you have a bolt that is meant to hold the door shut. The bolt itself is tied with a string, some form of a cord to the door, but because of the length of the rope or the cord, the bolt reaches the ground. So no olim bo b'mikdash. You're allowed to lock such a door with it in the Beis Hamikdash. So there's a general leniency in the Beis Hamikdash for the most part for rabbinic laws. Rabbinic prohibitions are usually waived in the Beis Hamikdash for a host of reasons. But basically, when the rabbis instituted certain restrictions, they did not institute those restrictions in the Beis Hamikdash area. However, avalo b'Medina, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Outside the Beis Hamikdash, such a bolt that drags on the ground, cannot be used. V'hamunach, a bolt that rests on the ground, so a bolt that doesn't have any cord. So basically, again, it's this like thing which is going to stick into the door, but it's not attached to the door in any way. So to go ahead and put it on Shabbos, at least according to the Tanakama, kan v'kan aser is prohibited not only outside the Beis Hamikdash, but even in the grounds of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because not presumably, but because this Tana understands that a bolt which is not attached to the ground, not attached to the door, is something which you take out and you put in. That is something which is actually full-fledged binyan. You're fully building something on Shabbos, and therefore, if it's aser midoraisa, if it's aser biblically, then it's going to be aser not only in our homes but also in the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehuda Omer hamunach mutar b'mikdash. He disagrees. He says one which is completely unattached is allowed in the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because he understands that one which even though it's not attached to the ground, it's not attached to the door, it is not considered building. It's part of the structure, and yes, it comes apart. It comes completely apart, but at the end of the day, it's part of the structure, and therefore it's only forbidden rabbinically, and therefore in the Beis Hamikdash grounds you'd be allowed to use such a bolt on Shabbos. The hanigrar b'Medina, and one which drags in the ground, is something which is attached to the door, and therefore he says it's not even forbidden rabbinically. You're allowed to use such a bolt on Shabbos. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan Tana Brisa. Ezeho neger hanigrar. What is the definition of a bolt that drags on the ground? Shenoalim b'mikdash of a lo b'Medina. The Tanakama says. What is the definition of a bolt that drags on the ground, which is allowed to be used in the Beis Hamikdash, but not in the provinces, not elsewhere? Kosher kasher v'taloi, anything which is attached. V'rosho echad megil aretz, and one of its ends reach the ground. Okay, so again, according to the Tanakama, this is exactly like the Tanakama of our Mishnah, who says that if it's a bolt that drags on the ground, that is forbidden rabbinically and therefore allowed in the Beis Hamikdash, not allowed anywhere else. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ze'af b'Medina mutar. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a bolt which is attached to the structure is allowed even in the provinces, even outside the Beis Hamikdash. Ela izehu neger. What is the definition of a bolt? Shenolim b'mikdash of a lo b'Medina, which is allowed to be used in the Beis Hamikdash but not in the provinces. Kol she'eno lo kasher v'lo taloi, something which is neither attached nor suspended. V'shomto manicha b'keren zavis, you take it out and you put it in the corner, meaning it's not attached at all. So something which is not attached at all, the Tanakama held that is aser midoraisa. That is full-fledged building. Rabbi Yehuda said no, that's aser midorabanan. Good? Okay.
I'm not sure. I think I'm a little bit lost.
Okay, so basically you have a door. You have a door and a bolt that basically holds the door down. Whether it holds it this way or holds it this way, basically it's going to hold the door down, right? So the Tanakama holds that one that is attached to the structure with a rope, right? This thing is attached to the building with a rope, but it's when you undo it, it basically just sits there. It's not very short, right? That it's but it's basically it's long enough that it's lying on the ground, right? The Tanakama holds that is aser midrabanan, and therefore you are not allowed to use it in a home, right? You'd be allowed to use it in the Beis Hamikdash, okay? Because by using it, it looks like you're building. Tanakama will hold that's aser midrabanan, can't be done at home. But Rabbi Yehuda says no, that's not even aser midrabanan. It's completely mutter. You're allowed to use that thing. Rabbi Yehuda agrees if it's a bolt which is not attached at all. You put it in, take it out. You put it in, and you put it down over here. And then you put it back. That he says is aser midrabanan, but mutter. But that's aser midrabanan. But aser midrabanan, and therefore mutter in the Beis Hamikdash. The Tanakama would hold that this bolt, which is completely comes out, is aser midoraisa. Okay, fine. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda in the case of a bolt that drags, that it is permitted to be used. Okay, so we're passing like Rabbi Yehuda over here that this bolt, that as long as it's attached to the structure, it is permitted. Rava comes along, Amarava Bahusha Kasher Badelis. This is only so when it's attached to the door and not attached to the doorway. In other words, right, there's two places that could be attached. This is your door, and here's the imaginary building. So Rava says, if it's attached to the building, right, that's still considered, then you put it into the door, that's still seen as building. But if it's attached to the door, and then you just it's really just a part of the door that comes off and gets put on, that's when it's going to be allowed. But it has to be attached to the door itself. Ask the Gemara, Eini v'harabi Tavla, ikla l'mechoza. If Tavla went to this town, Mechoza, chazla hu dehavatli be'ivra didash, and he saw a bolt that was suspended from the bar of the door and not from the door itself. Okay, it was something which was attached to the building, right, to the structure around the door, but not to the door itself. V'lo amar v'lehum v'lo midi, and he didn't speak up. He didn't protest. He said it was seemingly saying it's okay. So yet you just told me that Rava said that the only time we pass like Rabbi Yehuda is when the bolt is attached to the door itself. So when it says that nital beigdo hava, the bolt which Rav Tavla saw was one which was which could be picked up by the cord to which it was tied. In other words, we're learning another qualification to allow it. Until now, we've been talking about a cord which is not such a strong cord, and therefore we don't see it as so strongly attached to the structure. But here we're saying that even Rava would agree that if it's a strong, very strong cord, right, like a metal cord or whatever it is, and you're able to pick up the bolt with the cord, even if it's attached to the building, not to the door, then it's still seen as so much a part of the structure that it's not seen as building on Shabbos either, right? So basically, again, what's coming out is we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, that even if it's a bolt that's dragging on the ground, it could be used not only the base of Mikdash, but even in our homes. And one of two qualifications. Either one, it's a not such a strong cord, but it's attached to the door, or it's a very strong cord, it's attached to the building, but it's a very strong cord that the bolt itself can be lifted through the cord. By lifting the cord, the bolt can be lifted, then already it's seen as strong enough that it's seen as attached enough. Okay. Rav Avia Iklal Naharda. Rav Avia went to the city of Narda. Chazal hu Gavri saw a person, Davaka Kater Begemi, was fastening a bolt with a cord of reed. Okay. Amar Dain Velo Nitrok. He says this door cannot be used with such a bolt because it's going to break very easily. In other words, he says a bolt which is attached by a reed, that's a piece of grass, basically a strong piece of grass, that's not strong enough at all, and therefore that type of cord cannot be used on Shabbos. Okay. By Rav Zera asked the question, Nikmaz, if the bolt is pressed into the ground. In other words, until now we've been talking about a bolt which is going, you have the bolt which holds the door down, and so, this is basically if you're looking at it parallel, here's your door, here is your threshold, right? And here's your building, whatever, there's your building. Okay, and you have your bolt, which kind of goes in, and your bolt goes like this. Basically, the bolt goes into the threshold, right? But now we're asked, that's what we've been talking until now. Now we're talking about a bolt which actually goes all the way in to the ground, okay? So the one wants to know what the halacha is about such a bolt which goes into the ground, okay? So, Mahu. So if the bolt is pressed into the ground, what's the halacha? Amar Rav Yosef says, Mighty Baile, what's the question? Lo Shmi lo Yahadatina, did you not learn that was on the Brisa? Nishmat, if the bolt becomes disengaged, meaning the cord snaps, Asr, you can't use it. Nikmaz, if the bolt is pressed all the way into the ground, Mutter, the Tanakama says it is allowed. V'Yehuda Amar Nikmaz Afapishan Nishmat Asr, if the bolt is pressed all the way into the ground, even though it's attached to the door, it's prohibited. Why would it be prohibited? Any thoughts? Why would it be prohibited when it gets all the way into the ground? Sorry? It becomes, yeah, exactly. It's basically, it's essentially, it's very permanent like. It becomes too much like building. In other words, one thing, you attach something, you close it, when you bolt a door, okay, so it's not seen as like really building. When you stick it all the way into the ground itself, whoa, that's already like you're really building on Shabbos. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, who is more lenient in our Mishnah over here, he says, no, it's too building like, and therefore it's Asr, Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Halach, Rabbi Yehuda ben Nikmaz, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda in this case where it gets pressed all the way into the ground. What's the reason? Because it appears like you are building. Okay. Nechumi bar Zechariah asked Abaya, Asalo beis yad mahu. What's the halacha if you make a handle for the bolt? Okay, so the top of the bolt has it's not just a stick, but it has something at the top of it. Amrlei bechun.
Why would it make a difference?
Because we'll see. Buchna ka'amris. You speak of a bolt that resembles a pestle, right? Itmar, and we taught and what do we say about a pestle at the top? The bot. You can use it as a pestle. Bottom line is, it becomes like a kli. It becomes like a utensil, and it's no longer seen as like it's like one thing to take like a plank of wood and put it down, right? But if you now say, oh, this is if it has a handle, it looks much more utensil-like, just like the pestle. It had a very specific function, where it's used for something else. When it has a handle, even though it's not necessarily being used as a pestle, but now it has the name of a utensil on it. And when something is seen as a utensil, you don't see that as building. In other words, in Torah, we're talking about bolts, it's basically a piece of wood. But when something is seen as a utensil, that's going to be a ladder. And Rechumi bar ada asla beis yad mutter, and therefore Rechumi bar ada says, made a handle for the bolt. It's permitted for use. Yes.
I have double doors in my house, and one door opens, and the other one has essentially a bolt that goes into the threshold. So I can't put it back in the threshold on Shabbos?
Well, we paskin like Rav Yehuda, right? And so therefore, and again, it's attached to the door, right?
Yeah.
It's attached to the door. So Rav Yehuda would say, so first of all, probably it's attached in a way that it's not even dragging, I imagine. Right. It probably goes up. Right, most of our bolts.
Well, it's broken, so.
Okay, so you're lucky. We possibly agree with you either way, but even the Rabban, meaning a regular bolt and a regular door, right? The bolt goes up, exactly. And so that's like the Rabban role in some case where it's actually dragging. But even if it's broken, whatever, not fully functioning, we possibly Yehuda says as long as it's attached, as long as it's dragging and it's attached, it's no problem.
It doesn't assume that there's a lot of applicable, like halacha to a modern day.
Well, just
that's one, but in general, our doors are not.
Our doors are very different than this, but yeah, but that's a good case, meaning the bolts on the bottom, right, which is
and it's also broken, so we just don't open that side.
Yeah, we don't do it either.
Okay. But you could.
It's still secured in different ways.
Right. But that's a good point. So yeah, the bolts that we have that are, but those bolts are completely attached, and therefore that's not even. Meaning, I don't even know if the Rabbanan would disagree. Meaning, they're talking about a case where it's. I take back saying every even the Rabbanan would presumably agree. In other words, the Rabbanan are talking about a case where it's a bolt that comes out and is like lying over here, so it looks like you're building. But this is just it's a latch, right? Meaning, it's ultimately something which goes back and forth. That's something which is it's seen as part of the structure.
It's not dragging on the ground.
Even if it would be, in this case, I think the Rabbanan would also agree because it's just like part of the structure. It's not really like, they're talking about a case where it's like lying there on the side. Okay. But we just learned a very important halacha, which we're now going to go on a bit of a tangent. And that is something which is like a kli, something which is like utensil you're allowed to move on Shabbos. So, there was a beam in the home of Rab Padas. It took 10 people to move this beam. Okay, it sounds like funny, but keep in mind, back in the day, the Jews needed a lot of security. Every once in a while, they incite the mobs on them, so their doors were not just locked with a little lock, but sometimes they had like a good structure. So you needed 10 people to leave it. They shouted against the door to secure it at night. He never protested. He said, Torah's kli aleha. It's something which has the status of a utensil. Why? Because this beam was something which was also used as a bench, and therefore is allowed to be used. So what do we see from here? So this very relevant. Let's say, a couch on Shabbos. Right? There's discussion about can you move heavy things on Shabbos. The bottom line is it has utensil. It has a usage. So a person wants to move their couch on Shabbos because they want to, they need the space. They want to move things around. Bottom line is it's 100% mutter. What you shouldn't do, the Rambam says, the Rambam implies you shouldn't be moving things around for no reason, right? If you go ahead and start moving your couches, you want to rearrange your furniture, not allowed. But let's say you have a lot of guests, and therefore you want to move your table, you want to move your couch. It's a kli, it's a utensil, no problem. You're allowed to use it even though it's very heavy. There was a mortar in the home of Shmuel, which held a. Yeah.
So if this gigantic beam wasn't usable as a couch, as a utensil,
yeah,
then you couldn't move
then you could not move it. Then it would not have a free. Meaning, if you go to your garage and you have like beams of wood that you just that you're getting ready to make structures with or whatever it is, then it would be muktzah. It has to be something which has a function. So similarly, we have a story where the mortar in the home of Shmuel.
But it has a function. It locks the door.
Oh, if it was, you're saying if it was just being if it was just being used to lock the door. If it was just being used to lock the door, it seems that we're not. A kli is something it's the same way over here. We're talking about like the beam, which needs to have like a handle. Without that, it's just basically it's like an unfinished piece of wood. So even though the fact that I've used it, it's a good question. Meaning at the end of the day, if I use something, right? The Gemara over here is saying that if it's something which I have not used or doesn't have another function other than just blocking a door, it doesn't really have the same kli. But we do have a concept if I designate something as a utensil. designated for usage, it's known as a kli. And just the whole Gemara, you're asking in general. Meaning, why is the Gemara telling it? Just forget the case. The Gemara, why does the Gemara say you need to have a handle to be called a kli? The fact that it's being used as an opening for, as a bolt for a door, it should be already called a kli. I'm not sure.
But doesn't like transference of what an object's intention, like you have the thing that the pestle, the rod will go into, it's going to make it a lock on the door. The parts of it that it goes into, so the tubes that are attached to the door, when it's not being used, that has absolutely zero purpose, those bolts, because they're just part of the door. They don't.
But every utensil has no usage when I'm not using it, right? Meaning, at the end of the day, when I use it, it has a function. It holds the door closed.
The pestle now becomes something that could have been used to go and do this. It could be used as a hammer. It could be used for a lot of.
It doesn't. Yeah, but to be used considered a kli, I don't have to have like 5 functions. It doesn't be like a Swiss Army knife. Like I have to have a function, as long as meaning. Right, at the end of the day, this is being used to bolt a door. There, that in and of itself should be used. Now, when it came to the door, there was another issue. There was an issue of bona. There was an issue of bona, right? Meaning, I want to go back to that, right? There was an issue of bona because it looks like I'm building. So as long as it's not a refined piece of wood, therefore it looks like I'm building. Right, so I want to go. So by the door, I just want to distinguish. But by the door, it has to. There's a separate piece. Right, there's 2 issues over here. That's the answer. Sorry, there's 2 issues over here. There's 2 issues over here. Meaning, you're right. In a situation where I say this rock on the floor, I'm going to use it as a paperweight. So when I pick it up, I use the paperweight. Let's say to be safe, I used it once. The paperweight. That's fine. Over here, it's not just a matter of muktzah. The issue is bona. The issue is or looking like bona, looking a building. So therefore, with these things, you're right. If I use something, if something has a function, if I had a piece of wood that has a but the fact that I've used it as a lock for my door, that is not. But that doesn't matter. But the fact is, it's something which is just an unrefined piece of wood. It's just a piece of wood, so it looks like I'm building. Meaning, we're mixing 2 halachos. When it comes to laws of muksa, or at least I'm mixing 2 laws. So to answer your question, you're saying, why do I need to use this thing? If I'm using it for a door, it's no longer a utensil. It now is a utensil. That's true in general for the laws of muksa. If I use something for a certain function, it is now going to be seen as a utensil, even if it's a rock, which is not, sanded down in any way. But over here, we have another issue we have to deal with, which is that does this look like building? And as long as it's a plank of wood, then it's going to look like building.
Everybody knows I'm using it.
Doesn't matter, but fine. Yeah, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda is going to be more lenient. The Rabbanan say at the end of the day, it looks like it's something which is detached the house, attached to the house. Something attached to the house is more problematic. Okay. Fine. Let's go a little further. So the bottom line is we have he has Asisa the Havas by Shmuel. There was a mortar in the house of Shmuel. It was very large. It held a lesach, a very large mortar. Sharamar Shmuel Lemishti Adashi. He said it's allowed to be used against the door to keep it closed. Amar Tors Kliala again because it has the status of utensil. Okay. Shalach Le Rami Bar Cheskler Ramar. Name Alan Mar me Halen Mili Malyasa. Tell us some of the fine sayings. Demar Slamish made Rav Asi Bechefet Arba that you taught us in the name of Asi on the subject of the arches of a boat. So if you look at the picture on page 102A2. Basically on a boat, they had these like arches above the boat, which they would go ahead and put drapes on it when you would, basically the same way like modern boats have like an awning. So this was an awning. There's not such a sophisticated awning. It just basically had these arches, and when it got sunny, they would put a piece of cloth over them. So he says, remind us the halachas that you taught us about the arches of the boat. Shalach he sent to him, Hachim Arvasi, as Ravasi said, Hani Kefet Arba, the arches of a boat. Bisman Shish Mem Tefach, if they are a tefach thick, Inam Be'emehem Tefach, or if they are not a tefach thick, Ve'em Bein Zel Ezesh Losha, but there's not a gap between each one of 3 tefachim. In other words, there's a very small gap between them. Lamachar, maybe machzas v'versalin. You're allowed to the following day on Shabbos, you're allowed to put on a mat and drape it over them. My taima, most of oil arrive who v'shaper dummy. You're adding to already existing temporary oil, and that's permitted. So basically, what this means is anytime you have a structure already, which is already an oil, right? So over here, again, you have either the slats themselves are already thick and there's a very small amount between, they already are a tefach thick themselves, or they're very thin, but there is less than a gap of 3 tefachim between them, which means it's halachically treated as it's all attached. The next day you're allowed to add a mat on top of it. Where is this most relevant to? It's most relevant to 2 things. One is, the most relevant is probably a sukkah. To go ahead and add a mat to your sukkah, there are some who say you should already put it out a little bit, but there are many who point to this Gemara and say, no, what you're allowed to do is on sukkahs, if you want to prevent your sukkah from getting wet, since the sukkah already is an ohel, There's an ohel there. It's already a structure. All you're doing is putting something on top of it. It's no different, many argue, as putting a tablecloth on top of your table. Right? At the end of the day, there's an ohel there, there's a structure, but there already was a tent. There's already is a something there, and therefore, and that is, I would say, the normative halacha, that if you want to go ahead and add one of those like shlaks, add a sheet or whatever on top of your sukkah, you'd be allowed to do so. You don't have to put a little bit out there before Shabbos. Since there's already a ohel, you're allowed to put another structure on top of it. Okay, Hani Dichre Davile L'Rav Huna. There were some rams that belonged to Rav Huna. Divi Mama Baotula. During the day needed shade from the sun, but at night they needed fresh air. So made to Rav, they came in front of Rav, Amarle, Zil Kroch Budia, go and roll up the mat, Vishayr Tefach, leave one tefach of it spread out, Lamachar Pashta, and the next day unroll it. Okay, most of Lo Raihu, Vishaper Dami, because then all you're doing is adding to temporary structure. Right? So basically, what this means is that when you have a temporary structure, you have a little bit of an ohel. So some people actually, based on this, go ahead and if they have a baby stroller, right, and they have the canopy that goes on top of it, they open it up a little bit before Shabbos, so that on Shabbos all you're doing is adding onto it because it's already open. Now, there are many poskim who say you don't have to do so. Many poskim say no, because of the fact that it's structured in a way where it's attached by bolts and screws, and it basically goes back and forth, it therefore is permitted, and I would say that's the normative way that many of us paskin, that many rule, that therefore you don't have to open your baby thing a little bit, it's already in place, and therefore you're just going back and forth. Another application is, by the way, an umbrella, handheld umbrella would not be allowed, as we know, but an umbrella that is attached to the ground, an umbrella like on a table, like outdoor furniture, you would be allowed to use those on Shabbos. It's no different than the baby carriage is already attached to a structure, and it's basically going back and forth. An umbrella that is used for outdoor furniture, that's stuck into the ground. The same poskim who allow you to go ahead and use a baby stroller with the canopy would allow opening such an umbrella. Okay, open and close it.
You can actually open it.
Yeah. But as one that's attached to the ground already. In other words, if you go and attach it on Shabbos, but one that's like bolted, that has the thing that's stuck into, that would be allowed. Okay.
Umbrellas that stick onto your.
Yeah.
I'm assuming those are still not allowed.
We generally would avoid it just to be safe. Okay, let's try to get to the Mishnah. Amar Mishum bar Rav Chia, Vilon mutzlin tosa mutzlin forko b'Shabbos. A curtain is allowed to be hung and taken down on Shabbos. A curtain means just a standalone curtain. You're allowed to put it up on Shabbos. Kilas chasana mutzlin forko l'tos b'Shabbos. Canopy of a bridal bed is allowed to be taken down and hung up on Shabbos. A bridal bed is kind of like you'll see the picture. It's basically a bed and it has like a tent-like structure on top of it. Amar Rav Sheshes, B'Rav Avidi, a couple of qualifications. Lo Amar and Elshin begaga tefach. That's only if at the top there's not a tefach. If there's a tefach on top, then you just made a ohel. You just made a temporary tent, so you can't put this canopy, right? Just like you're not allowed to play tent, on Shabbos. You can't go ahead if it goes this way, then you can't put it on Shabbos. It's only if it's completely on as a triangle. If it has a roof of a tefach wide, then you're allowed to do so because then you're setting up a tefach. And as much as its roof is not allowed to be a tefach, only where the slope of the canopy is so steep that it doesn't amount to a tefach within 3 tefachim of the top, the top of the thing. So if you look at the second picture, right, if within 3 tefachim it already reaches 1 tefach wide, even if it doesn't have a tefach like this, but within 3 tefachim it already has a tefach of width, then it's also seen as if it's a tefach, and therefore it will be forbidden. If it at the width of the canopy it has a tefach within 3 tefachim of the apex, then it's going to be aser. Next page, b'shipua tefach. Only when there is no tefach underneath its slope. On the bottom, look all the way on the bottom. If there's granted, even if it's very narrow, but in the bottom, if it then goes tefach its slope, then it's going to be aser. We don't have time to get into why it's aser right now. That's machlokas in Masechah Sukkah. V'yesh b'shipua tefach shipue ohalim kolam dami. Then the sloping sides of the canopies are just like a canopy. There's an opinion in Masechah Sukkah which says that if the slope is a tefach, it goes down straight a tefach, then it's like there's a tefach at the top. Okay, va'amar, fine. So the bottom line is, as Rashi points out, then you're left with a very, very, very narrow canopy, right? You have to be I don't know how narrow. Think about how narrow we're talking about over here. How in the world are you going to sleep under that? Well, it's not a very practical bed. So Rashi points out, if you look at the picture, it's actually kind of like an accordion bed. It actually goes up and down, up and down, up and down. That's the only way it's actually going to work. Okay, if Rav Shesha, Braid Rav Idi, Sayana Shari, a felt hat is permitted to be worn on Shabbos. Vatanya Aser, there's a brayso which says you can't wear a felt hat. So Lokash Gemara wants to say, Had isbei tefach, had leisbei tefach. So the first Gemara answers, like your case. One case is talking about where the hat actually has a tefach, that's what's going to be forbidden. And the other says, no, it's less. Elamiata, Sharbe, Beglima Tefach. If one wants to take their cloak, if you wear your talis, and you put your talis over your head more than a tefach, it's going to be Hachinami to Asr, it's going to be forbidden. That can't be. And the truth is, you technically are allowed to wear those umbrella hats. I wouldn't recommend it, not just because it looks silly, but the point is that you are allowed to take your talis and put it over your head, even though it's a tefach. That's not a problem. So when it says, Alakasha, Had Mahadek, Hodel Mahadek. What we're talking about is not a matter of ohel. We're talking about walking outside on Shabbos with a hat that's very loose. Why? Because in a place you don't have an Eruv, if you're wearing a hat that's very loose, it's very possible your hat's going to fly off. And therefore, it's important that you wear a hat that, if you're wearing a very loose hat on Shabbos, or a loose yarmulke, I should say, on Shabbos, or a loose, head covering on Shabbos, that's usher because there's when there's no Eruv, because the chance is going to fly off. If you're walking in a place with no Eruv, you have to make sure that whatever's on your head is attached securely. Have a great day.